Bar for bar album reviews. Lloyd Banks, The Course of the Inevitable. The Course of the Inevitable is the latest album from New York rapper and G-Unit member Lloyd Banks. This album comes after a long hiatus from his last project dropping in 2016, but don't you worry, he hasn't missed a step. The project was announced just a week or so prior to its release, with the tracklist coming out the same week of its release. It has features from people like Freddie Gibbs, Roc Marciano, Ransom, and more, so you can only assume we're in for some dope lyricism over some pretty gritty boom-bap beats. The album is a bit longer than most these days, at a total runtime of an hour and 8 minutes with 18 tracks, but I do believe that was intentional. Banks does take his time between albums and projects, so it may be a little while since we hear from him again. So maybe that's why we got a longer album with more tracks. Listening through this album, there were thankfully no major points at which it felt as though there were tracks that were like just kind of filler, or if it was just dragging on. So that's dope. Just know going into this that it is a bit longer though, and we might not be too used to it these days. The album starts off strong with the first track, Propane. Immediately you should be able to tell if you're going to like this album because we're introduced to the sound and lyrics that we'll be getting throughout most of it. The opening lines to this track definitely set the tone well, with $100 bills for my sit-up drills, my Benji reps, ignorant, and I don't give two fucks with Fendi Fs. Learning my habit, consistency made the memory stretch. Turn you into an addict, your lady will kiss a Bentley chest. It just starts off so aggressive and is definitely a dope intro track that gives you a good look at what he's all about. This goes into the next track, Sidewalks. Here we have Banks talking about street life, with him telling us to stay out the streets and that the sidewalk is for, just chilling and it's safer there. With his first verse, he gets into the idea that people are cloning him and copying his style, but it doesn't seem like he's really had issue with it. Then in the second verse he says when he dies, mural his face on every borough, and then goes on to talk about how much of an impact that he's had and how New York's essentially a melting pot for sounds. There's just so many different experiences and sounds to gather, so even when you're influenced by someone else, you can still have your own voice, if that makes sense. This brings us to the first guest feature from Freddie Gibbs with the track Empathy. I believe I saw something about this track being added pretty much last minute, but in any case, it's a great addition. Although that may be cheating because I'm just a huge fan of Freddie Gibbs. With this track, as well as the other tracks with featured rappers, Banks makes it a point to still maintain two verses, as well as making sure that he starts and ends the track. This is a style that's not too common these days, I feel. And it's definitely something that I've always appreciated. The beat accompanied by the flow Banks has just sounds so good here. I also really like how Freddie Gibbs had to check himself in his own verse when he said, castrated dick in his mouth when they found him dead. Yo, slow down, Fred. We get another feature on the next track, Early Exit, with Roc Marciano. The production here is a bit different with the sample, but still maintains a gritty sound. When Lloyd Banks comes in, he's just riding the beat so smoothly. It's kind of ridiculous. The track is about pretty much how you never know when you're going to go. You might take an early exit. Roc's verse is solid here too, but the vocals felt a little bit weird to me. It's almost like he recorded his verse on a phone in the most echoey room he could find. And then they tried to match it and fix the levels, but I mean, it could have been intentional, but that's just something that I noticed. Things return to the more typical sound with Formaldehyde featuring Benny the Butcher. In fact, this is the exact beat that I expect Benny or anyone from Griselda to be able to rap over pretty well, so it just makes sense to have him here. With one of the first lines, Banks lets us know, just let the album ride, I'm back in the zone, it's 2009, which really does show up throughout the project. Back then, albums were longer, and there was typically less filler as well. We'd also go quite a bit longer between projects, and streaming wasn't as prevalent, so we'd end up sitting with albums for much longer than we do nowadays. Benny's verse is solid as well, with him talking about how dope he is, and how he spent 2019 putting rappers back on their feet. That's a great line because it's really what he did back then, and it's something that he's made reference to on other tracks and other features as well. After these few features, we're greeted by a solo track from Banks with Death by Design. I love how the track starts off with, you know what, you talk too much, you need to shut the fuck up. It's just a funny start to a song to me. The song itself is really just about others who may be wasting his time, but he also remembers that he kind of was that guy too. Just trying to get some money up, but this was all design and this was actually his plan all along. With Food, we have another feature, this time from Styles P, and again, we get another dope guest verse. Styles P just slides over this beat and has always brought in solid bars, so I don't know if anyone would have doubted him. The production is also a little bit different this time around, with an almost orchestral sound to it. This track is all about how they kept things pushing and proved themselves because otherwise they end up as food. Crown is the first track that really stood out to me, mostly due to the production on it. It's a very familiar sample, but I can't really place it. It's a bit slowed down compared to the last track, but that doesn't stop Lloyd Banks from just riding on it like it was nothing. The track is pretty straightforward and is about the road he took to where he is now, and is also a reminder that he who wears the crown knows it's heavy. We return to another feature with Falsified, which features Ransom, who's just been killing it consistently for so long, and I'm glad he's getting the looks and recognition that he's been getting recently. This song is about how people can change up on you and say the things that you did were falsified. It's an interesting take, an interesting thing to hear, because usually it's less about people going around saying that you're lying and more that they're lying about the things that they did. I guess it's totally plausible that things could go this way too. It's just something that I personally had not considered. It also does get into a little bit about people lying about themselves as well, though. Break Me Down changes things up a bit again by going a little higher energy. Back in the day, I would have thought of this as more of a radio grab because the chorus is pretty catchy, but with the rapping, there's no way beyond the radio. It's just too hard. I tend to not return to this track too frequently though, mostly because it messes with the flow of the album a little bit more than some of the other tone changes that we've gotten thus far. Context-wise, it's dope and about how the devil's trying to break him down, but he keeps it pushing even through the paranoia and all the craziness. Next we have Commitment, which is all about commitment and relationship woes that he's been through. Again though, we see a shift in sound which doesn't really allow the album to flow as well as I personally would like, but it's not a huge deal. This track also has a dope sample as well that really helps to sell what he's saying throughout it. Pain, Pressure, Paranoia touches on a few of the things that we've heard so far on the project, which is literally the name of the track, Pain, Pressure, and Paranoia. And he uses these things that most would feel are incredibly negative, and most people would be afraid to go through as examples and teaching moments, essentially. Each of these three things have helped shape him into who he is today, and this is meant to show us that as well as how we could potentially utilize the negativity in our lives to better ourselves and grow. Each one of these verses we get also goes into a little bit of each with basically a short story, and I think that's really dope. Another way it could have gone is just do a verse for each one, Pain, Pressure, and Paranoia, but that might not have flowed as well. This brings us to one of the more interesting tracks, Stranger Things. I only say that because it seems to be talking directly about 50 Cent, which is something that even if you're not familiar with G-Unit, you would probably pick up on. Clearly, Banks feels some sort of way regarding the strange things that 50's been doing and how their relationship may be a bit strained. He doesn't necessarily go after him in any way, like he's not hating on him or anything directly, but it sounds more like he's trying to understand, or he does understand, why 50's doing these things. The chorus also makes it kind of feel sad with him saying, "You lift me up and shoot me down. It looks painful for you to smile. I feel a space between your hugs. I hate the way you show me love." Drop 5 changes things back to more of what we heard earlier on the project. The beat is also really interesting because it builds up, and you would expect it to go somewhere around like the Crown or Food route, but when it comes in, it's just completely different in the best way possible. As far as what the song's about, it seems to be mostly about getting revenge. If you take one of his homies, they take 5 of yours. They won't let that slide. Next we have Panic featuring Sayari the Kid. I'm not too big on this song, mostly due to the chorus, in all honesty. It's not a bad song lyrically, but the chorus is just too for me to like really return to. Like, you know how I said that last song, Break Me Down, was a radio grab? This really sounds like that, and I'm not really there for it. Smoke and Mirrors is a pretty intense song about how things you consider to be real might end up being all smoke and mirrors, aka fake. This intensity is brought about by there only being one verse, and it's a long verse, and then the song ending with the chorus. With something of this subject matter, I think that's totally appropriate. Banks starts off the track saying, "You don't remind me nothing of family, why would I call you that?" Which makes it seem to be more about a particular person rather than multiple people, but it could totally go either way. He also goes on to talk about how pain takes a toll on your body, but he's not necessarily talking about physical pain. I mean, obviously that will take a toll on your body, but the emotional and mental pain of learning that someone that you thought was with you, who really isn't, is immense for sure. Smoke and Mirrors ends essentially with a firing squad that leads really well into Dishonorable Discharge featuring Vado, and this track is dope and a great way to start wrapping up the album. The final track on the album is COTI, which is a great outro track to this album. The track is really about how things can be inevitable, and does well to touch on a lot of the same topics that Banks touched on earlier in the project. The beat here also does a good job of winding things down, because it's not one of those super heavy hitting beats or super high energy tracks that make you think there's more coming, but it's a bit more slowed down. Overall, this album was really dope. The biggest criticism I have is the sequencing, as sometimes it felt as though some of the songs didn't flow well into the next one, but even that wasn't the biggest deal to me. Another thing that I saw a lot of people talking about was the mixing and mastering. I personally didn't notice too much of an issue with it, even when listening with some nice headphones and using Tidal's master quality. I did notice that some of the drums were a bit muddier than I personally would like, and that was more of an issue when I was in the car, because it kind of became hard to hear what Banks was saying. And yeah, sometimes like Banks was mixed a little bit lower, at least for me. But it's funny because all the features sounded just fine on those tracks, so I don't know what happened. I definitely do recommend checking out this album though, especially if you're into dope lyricism and solid content, because I definitely enjoyed it. It might be hard for some people to get through just because it is over an hour long and we might not be really used to that anymore, but I'd say it's worth it. My favorite tracks of now are Propane, Empathy, Formaldehyde, Crown, and Stranger Things. I mentioned it in the beginning, but it's likely that it's going to be some time before we get another project from Lloyd Banks, given his typical release cycles. It makes sense for him to have released a project of this length if that is the case, because there's just more to pick up on and listen to as time goes on, especially when compared to artists that drop multiple projects a year that tend to be a little bit shorter. Not saying that it's bad to do that, it's just a different strategy and works differently for different people. You can be a dope lyricist and drop hella projects a year, but then you also have people like Banks who just drop one project every few years. So, whatever works for you. With that said though, I look forward to whatever he's got coming next, whenever that may be. That about wraps up this review. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this album and what your favorite tracks are. Also, like and subscribe if you want to see more content and reviews like this one. Thank you for watching, and please stay safe out there.